My wife cheated next door. I walked away with dignity and strength. Welcome to Michael Tells Stories. Here, I share daily infidelity stories about unfaithful wives. Thank you for listening. The first thing people misunderstand about betrayal is that it arrives loudly. With shouting, slammed doors, and obvious villains, when in truth it often comes quietly, disguised as routine, hidden inside the ordinary rhythms of a life you thought was safe. And that was how it happened to me. On a Tuesday evening that smelled faintly of grilled meat from next door and the detergent my wife preferred because it reminded her. She once said, of her childhood home, we had been married for 11 years. Not the kind of marriage people wrote poems about, but the kind built slowly, patiently, through shared grocery lists, unspoken agreements about who took out the trash, and long nights where we lay side by side, scrolling through our phones, our legs touching just enough to remind us we belonged to each other. Her name was Claire, and she was beautiful in a way that did not demand attention. The kind of beauty that settled into a room and stayed there, unnoticed until suddenly it was gone. I was the man who lived next door to the man she cheated with. And at the time, I didn't know how much that detail would come to define the rest of my life. The neighbor's name was Evan. Mid-30s, recently divorced, polite in the shallow, careful way men become after they've lost something and don't want to lose face again. We exchanged nods when we took out the trash. Short conversations about the weather, about property taxes, about how quiet the street was compared to the city. He moved in 6 months before everything unraveled, and I remember helping him carry a sofa inside his house while Claire brought us lemonade. Smiling too brightly, laughing too easily at things that weren't funny. A detail that lodged itself somewhere in my mind long before I understood why it mattered. Back then, I thought it was kindness. Or maybe boredom. Because boredom can look a lot like generosity when you don't know what to do with yourself. Claire had changed slowly, in ways that were easy to excuse. She stayed longer at work, claimed new projects, new pressures. She took more care with her appearance. Not dramatically, just enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention. Which I wasn't, not at first. She started listening to music with headphones even when we were in the same room. A small wall of sound between us. And when I reached for her at night, her body was there but her mind felt distant, as if she were already elsewhere, rehearsing a different version of herself that did not include me. I told myself all marriages went through seasons like this. That love wasn't supposed to feel urgent forever. That maturity meant accepting the quiet. What I didn't realize was that quiet, when it stretches too long, becomes a place where secrets can breathe. The night I found out, I wasn't looking for the truth. I had gone outside to take a phone call from my sister. Pacing along the side of the house where the fence was low enough that you could see into Evan's backyard if you weren't trying too hard not to. The lights were on inside his kitchen, and through the window, framed by yellow warmth and the ordinary clutter of a life half started, I saw my wife. She was barefoot, wearing the sweater I had bought her 3 winters ago. The one she claimed was too big. Laughing in a way I had not heard in months. Her hand resting casually on the edge of the counter while his stood far too close to hers. There was no dramatic kiss in that moment. No obvious line crossed that could not be explained away, and yet my body reacted before my mind could catch up. a cold wave rising from my stomach to my chest. Because intimacy has a posture. And I recognized it instantly. I didn't confront her that night. I went back inside, sat on the edge of our bed, and listened to the house settle around me. Every creak and hum suddenly loud, suddenly accusatory. When she came home an hour later, carrying the faint smell of someone else's cologne mixed with the detergent she loved, she kissed my cheek and apologized for being late. Her voice calm, practiced, almost tender, and I realized with a clarity that hurt more than anger ever could that this was not a mistake she had made once, but a version of herself she had already decided to protect over the next 2 weeks. I watched my own life as if it belonged to someone else. I noticed how she angled her phone away from me, how she volunteered to walk the dog at times she never had before, how Evan suddenly needed help with small things that could easily wait until I was at work. I didn't follow her. I didn't check her messages. There was a strange dignity in not needing proof beyond what my heart already knew. A quiet line I refused to cross because once you begin hunting for betrayal, you risk becoming smaller than the person who betrayed you. Still, the truth found me anyway. One afternoon, coming home early with a headache, I heard voices next door through the open window. Her voice unmistakable, soft, urgent, speaking my name only to explain why it no longer defined her when I finally spoke to her. It was in our kitchen, under the same light where we had once planned vacations and argued about paint colors. She didn't deny it. She cried, but not in the way people cry when they are caught. It was the crying of someone who had already mourned the version of the story where they were innocent. She told me she felt unseen, that she didn't know how it happened, that it didn't mean she didn't love me. Phrases strung together like excuses she hoped might build a bridge back to safety. I listened without interrupting, noticing how calm my hands were, how my voice, when I finally spoke, didn't shake. I told her I believed her feelings were real. And that was precisely why I would not beg her to stay. Walking away was not dramatic. There were no ultimatums, no neighbors watching from behind curtains. I packed a bag, slowly, deliberately, choosing only what I needed, leaving behind the rest without resentment. Because possessions are easy to replace, but self-respect, once compromised, is not. As I stepped outside, the evening air felt heavy. The houses on our street lined up like witnesses to a trial that would never be held. And from next door, I could hear Evan's television murmuring, unaware or perhaps already waiting. I did not look in that direction. I did not need to. I walked down the driveway with my shoulders straight, my grief contained but intact, understanding for the first time that strength is not loud, and dignity does not require an audience. I stayed the first night in a small hotel near the highway, the kind designed for people who are passing through rather than arriving. And as I lay awake listening to the distant sound of cars slicing through the dark, I realized how strange it was that my life, which had once felt anchored and immovable, now fit entirely inside a single duffel bag placed carefully at the foot of a bed that was not mine. Grief did not come all at once, instead it arrived in waves. Uneven and unpredictable. Moments of sharp clarity followed by long stretches of numbness where my mind refused to cooperate with my heart. I did not cry that night, not because I was strong, but because my body had not yet caught up with what had happened. and I understood instinctively that tears would come later, when it was safe to let them in the morning. I called my manager and asked for a week off, my voice steady, professional, as if this were just another administrative inconvenience rather than the quiet collapse of the life I had built. Then I called my sister, who listened without interrupting, who did not rush to villainize Claire or offer solutions, who simply said she was proud of me for leaving the way I did. Words that landed deeper than any advice could have. Pride, I was learning, was not arrogance but alignment. The sense that your actions and your values were still facing the same direction even when everything else had turned. Claire texted me later that day. Not apologies, not confessions, but practical questions disguised as concern. Whether I was safe, whether we could talk, whether I needed anything from the house. I replied briefly, kindly, keeping my sentences clean and restrained, refusing to let anger become the language through which we negotiated the end of our marriage. She asked if I would come back to discuss things properly, and for the first time since leaving, I felt something close to fear, not of her, but of the possibility that proximity might blur the clarity I had fought to preserve. I told her we could talk, but not yet, and not there. The days that followed were defined by small acts of rebuilding. I found a short-term rental across town, sparse and unfamiliar, with sunlight that entered at odd angles and forced me to notice the time of day again. I went for long walks without a destination, letting my thoughts stretch out instead of spiraling inward. And in those walks, I began to see the marriage not as a single failure but as a series of quiet compromises that had accumulated over time. I had loved Claire sincerely, but I had also become complacent, mistaking stability for intimacy, assuming that presence alone was enough to be felt. This realization did not excuse her betrayal, but it did free me from the comfortless fiction that only one of us had changed when we finally met. It was in a cafe far from our neighborhood, neutral ground where memories had no leverage. She looked smaller somehow, as if the version of herself that had been so certain a month ago was already eroding under the weight of consequences. She reached for my hand and stopped halfway, respecting a boundary she had learned too late. She told me the affair was over, that Evan had been a distraction, not a future, that losing me had shocked her into clarity. I listened, again without interrupting, noticing how familiar this posture felt. The way I had always been the container for her uncertainty. When I spoke, I told her I believed she was telling the truth. And that truth, in this case, did not change the outcome. Trust, I said, was not something you rebuild with promises but with time. And time was no longer something I was willing to gamble with. She cried then. Openly, unguarded, and for a brief moment, I felt the old instinct to comfort her rise up inside me. Muscle memory masquerading as love. I let the feeling pass. I told her I wished her well, genuinely, and that I hoped she would learn to sit with herself rather than reaching for someone else to fill the silence. When I stood to leave, she asked if there was any chance we might find our way back to each other someday. And I answered honestly that I did not know, but that if we ever did, it would only be as two people who had grown beyond the versions that broke us. That answer, I realized later, was not for her, it was for me. The divorce process was mercifully straightforward, marked by paperwork rather than drama. And as weeks turned into months, my life began to take on a different texture. I returned to old habits I had abandoned without noticing. Cooking meals that took time. Reading novels without checking my phone. Reconnecting with friends I had slowly drifted from. There was loneliness, yes, but it was clean, not contaminated by suspicion or self-doubt. And in that space, something unexpected began to form. A quiet confidence rooted not in achievement but in survival. I had been tested, and I had not lost myself in the process. One evening, while unpacking the last of my boxes, I found a photograph from our early years. Claire and I laughing on a beach, windblown and careless, and instead of pain, I felt gratitude. That version of love had been real, even if it had not been permanent, and honoring it did not require clinging to its remains. I placed the photo back in the box and closed it gently. Understanding that closure is not about forgetting but about remembering without bleeding months later. I heard through mutual friends that Claire had moved away, that she was starting over in a different city, alone this time, and I hoped sincerely that she would find the happiness she had been searching for in the wrong places. As for Evan, he faded into irrelevance, a footnote in a story that was never really about him. My strength had not come from winning or proving anything, but from choosing myself without bitterness. From walking away not because I was weak, but because I was finally strong enough to know what I deserved. Time did what it always does when you stop fighting it, it moved forward. Indifferent but fair, carrying me with it into a life that no longer revolved around absence. The first year after the divorce was not heroic, not cinematic, but it was honest, filled with quiet mornings where I learned to make coffee for one. Evenings where silence no longer felt like an accusation, and weekends that belonged entirely to me. I changed jobs, not out of necessity but intention, choosing a smaller firm with fewer titles and more human conversations. A place where no one knew my past and therefore did not expect me to perform strength as a role. I learned that dignity, when practiced long enough, becomes ease. It was during this season of steadiness that I met her. Not through grand coincidence but routine. The most underestimated force in adult life. Her name was Emily, and she worked at the community arts center near my apartment. A place I had started visiting on Sunday afternoons because they hosted quiet talks and small exhibitions that asked nothing from you except attention. She was not loud, not dazzling in the way people often mistake for chemistry, but there was a composure to her, a warmth that did not rush forward or pull away, and the first thing I noticed was how fully she listened. As if the present moment deserved her complete respect, we spoke casually at first. Comments about a painting, about how strange it was that some stories could feel familiar even when you had never lived them. There was no spark that demanded to be named, only a calm recognition, the subtle sense that you were standing next to someone who had made peace with their own history. Over time, those conversations extended into coffee, then walks, then dinners that lasted longer than planned because neither of us felt the need to impress the other. When she asked about my past, I told her the truth without dramatizing it, and she received it without flinching, without trying to fix or reframe it, a response that felt like permission to be whole rather than healed. Emily had her own scars, though she wore them lightly. She had loved deeply once, chosen to leave when love turned into erasure, and built a life afterward that prioritized self-respect over reconciliation. There was no bitterness in her voice when she spoke of it. Only clarity, and that clarity was contagious. With her, I discovered a different kind of intimacy. One that did not rely on constant reassurance or shared history but on mutual presence. On the understanding that two complete people could choose each other without surrendering themselves. Meanwhile, Claire re-entered my life briefly. Not by choice but necessity. There were final documents to sign. Loose ends that refused to tie themselves. And when we met again, over a year after everything had ended, she was different, not diminished, but refined, as if solitude had sanded down the parts of her that once reached outward too quickly. She told me she was in therapy, that she was learning to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. That for the first time in her adult life, she felt responsible for her own happiness. There was no attempt to rekindle anything. No lingering entitlement to my attention. Only a quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost and what had been learned. I felt something then that surprised me. Not longing, not regret, but respect in that moment. I understood that her happiness did not have to be built on my forgiveness or her redemption. It could exist independently, shaped by choices she was finally making for herself. When we parted, there was no ache, only closure, the kind that arrives not with certainty but acceptance. She walked away with her head high, and I realized that despite the damage she had caused, she had not been destroyed by it. And that mattered. Growth, after all, does not require villains. It requires accountability. My relationship with Emily unfolded slowly. Deliberately. A conscious refusal to rush into the illusion of permanence. We traveled together, not to escape our lives but to observe them from different angles. Discovering how well we navigated unfamiliar places without losing ourselves or each other. There were disagreements, of course. Moments of misunderstanding that tested our patience. But there was also repair. Immediate and sincere. Conversations that did not end until both of us felt seen. I never once wondered where she was or who she was texting. And she never mistook my calm for disinterest. Trust, I learned, feels unremarkable when it is intact. And that is precisely its gift. One evening, sitting on her balcony as the city settled into twilight, Emily asked me what strength meant to me now. I thought about the man I had been, standing in a driveway with a bag in his hand, choosing dignity over desperation, and I answered honestly that strength was not about enduring pain silently or walking away dramatically, but about aligning your actions with your values even when no one is watching. Even when staying would be easier. She smiled, not because the answer impressed her, but because she recognized it. And in that recognition, I felt something solidify between us. A shared language built not on promises but principles. Years later, when people ask me about my past, about my first marriage, about betrayal and recovery, I tell them the truth without embellishment. I say that my wife cheated with the man next door, that I walked away, and that doing so changed everything. I say that dignity did not save my marriage, but it saved me, and in doing so, it made space for love that did not require sacrifice to survive. Claire found her own happiness, earned through self-confrontation and solitude, and I found mine through patience, presence, and the courage to believe that starting over is not a failure, but a skill. In the end, there were no winners or losers, only people who learned, too late or just in time. That strength is quiet. Love is a choice renewed daily. And walking away with your head held high can sometimes be the most profound act of respect you ever give yourself. And the greatest gift you leave behind for everyone involved. The ending of a story like this does not arrive with fireworks or declarations shouted into the wind. It arrives gradually. Almost invisibly. In the way your body relaxes into a life that finally fits. Emily and I did not rush toward milestones as if they were proof of success. Instead, we let time test us gently, in shared routines and unremarkable days. Because we both understood that real commitment is revealed not in passion but in consistency. We learned each other's quiet habits. How she liked the windows open even in winter. How I needed silence in the mornings before words could find their shape. And these details, small and ordinary, became sacred precisely because they were chosen, not assumed when we eventually decided to build a life together. It felt less like a leap and more like a continuation, as if we had already been living the truth of that decision long before we named it. We moved into a home that belonged to neither of our pasts. A space free of echoes, where every piece of furniture was selected intentionally, not inherited from a previous version of ourselves. There were no ghosts there, only the present, unfolding calmly, and I realized that this, more than anything, was what healing looked like, not erasing the past, but no longer arranging your future around it. Emily flourished in ways that had nothing to do with me. And that was what made loving her so easy. Her work at the Arts Center expanded. She curated exhibitions, mentored younger artists, and spoke publicly about creative resilience. About how making something beautiful after loss was not denial but defiance. I watched her from the audience more than once, feeling a quiet pride that did not seek ownership, only admiration. She did not need to be saved, and she did not need permission to shine. And loving her meant standing beside her, not in front or behind. As for Claire, her life found its own steady rhythm. Years after our divorce, I received a letter from her. Handwritten, thoughtful, unhurried. She wrote about the woman she had become. About learning to stay when things grew uncomfortable. About choosing solitude when it was necessary and connection when it was earned. She thanked me, not for forgiving her, but for leaving when staying would have allowed her to continue lying to herself. There was no longing in her words. No attempt to reopen doors that had closed for good. Only gratitude and accountability, offered without expectation. I read the letter once, then again, and placed it carefully in a drawer. Not as a wound, but as evidence that people can grow after causing harm. That endings do not have to be cruel to be final. Sometimes. On quiet evenings, I think back to the man I was on that Tuesday night. Standing outside his own home, watching his life fracture through someone else's window. I think about how close I came to staying, to negotiating my worth, to confusing endurance with love, and I feel compassion for him, not pity, because he did the bravest thing he knew how to do at the time. He chose dignity over fear. Even when dignity offered no immediate comfort. Now, years later, my life is not louder, not more impressive, but it is honest. I wake up beside a woman who meets me where I am, who does not mistake calm for weakness or devotion for entitlement. I live in a home where trust is so present it is almost invisible. And I understand at last that happiness is not found in being chosen at any cost, but in choosing yourself first, so that when love arrives, it adds rather than replaces. My wife cheated next door, and I walked away with dignity and strength. She found her own path, earned through self-awareness and courage. I found mine through restraint, patience, and the refusal to abandon myself. There were no villains in the final chapter, only people who learned, some through loss, some through distance, that love without respect is not love at all, and that the truest happy ending is the one where everyone stands upright, whole, and free.